Welcome to everyone. I'm James Jensen, today's webinar chair. I'm a contractor supporting the Office of Indian Energy Policy and Programs Tribal Energy Webinar Series. Today's webinar, titled Microgrids for Resilient Electricity Systems, is the third webinar of the 2021 DOE Tribal Energy Webinar Series. Let's go over some event details. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be made available on DOE's Office of Indian Energy Policy and Programs website in about 1 week. Copies of today's presentation slides will be posted to the Office of Indian Energy's website shortly after this webinar, if not before. And in fact, I think they already are posted, and we'll post the address in the chat shortly. Because we are recording this webinar, all phones have been muted. We will answer your written questions at the end of the final presentation. You can submit a question at any time by clicking the question button located in the webinar control box on your screen and typing your question. We'll get started with some opening remarks from Lizana Pierce. Ms. Pierce is a senior engineer and the deployment supervisor for the Office of Indian Energy Policy and Programs and is duty stationed in Golden, Colorado. She oversees the deployment program, which is national in scope. Specifically, the deployment program includes financial assistance, technical assistance, and education and outreach. She also implements national funding opportunities and administers some of the resultant tribal energy project grants and agreements. She has over 25 years of experience in project development and management and has been assisting tribes in developing their energy resources for the last 20+ years. She holds a Bachelor's of Science degree in Mechanical Engineering from Colorado State University and pursued a Master's in Business Administration through the University of Northern Colorado. Lizana, the virtual floor is now yours.
Thank you, James, and hello, everyone. Every time James reads my bios, I feel like I've aged myself. But anyway, I join James in welcoming you all to today's webinar. The webinar series is sponsored by the Office of Indian Energy Policy and Programs, otherwise referred to as the Office of Indian Energy. The Office of Indian Energy is chartered to promote Indian energy development, efficiency, and use to help reduce or stabilize energy costs, enhance and strengthen Indian tribal energy and economic infrastructure, and to bring electric-powered service to Indian lands and homes. To provide this assistance, our deployment program partners with Indian tribes and Alaska Native villages to overcome the barriers to energy development. Our deployment program is composed of a three-pronged approach, as James mentioned, consisting of financial assistance provided on a competitive basis, technical assistance, which is free of charge to Indian tribes and tribal entities, and education and capacity building. This Tribal Energy webinar series is just one example of our education and capacity building efforts. Specifically, the webinar series is intended to provide attendees with information on tools and resources to develop and implement tribal energy plans, programs, and projects, to highlight tribal energy case studies, which you'll hear today, and identify business strategies tribes can use to expand their energy options and develop sustainable local economies. This year's webinar series is focusing on how tribal energy projects can improve community resilience, foster economic development, and support environmental stewardship. In this third webinar of the series, we will look specifically at microgrids and how they can increase community resilience. We hope the webinar series as a whole is useful to you, but we also welcome your feedback. So please let us know if there are ways we can make the series better. You can send your feedback to our main email address at indianenergy@hq.doe.gov. Before I turn the floor back over to James, I did also want to personally thank all of the presenters for giving up your time and preparing for and for presenting on today's webinar. So again, thank you all very much. And with that, the virtual floor is yours, James.
Thanks, Lizana. I'm going to introduce all the presenters now, but first a brief message for Glenn Lodge, one of our presenters. You're registered as a attendee right now. And so when it's your time to speak, what we'll have to do to allow you to speak is unmute your specific line. So just stand by, and when it is your turn to speak, we'll unmute you. And so sorry for the whole audience having to hear that, but we're having some technical difficulties with one of our panelists getting on. So with that, I'll introduce all of our speakers, and then we can get started. For our first presentation, we'll hear from Dr. Stan Atsidi. Dr. Atsidi is a member of the Navajo Nation, tribal member. He received his BS and Master's of Science degrees in electrical engineering from New Mexico State University in 1993 and 1995. In 2006, he was the first American Indian male to receive a PhD in electrical and computer engineering from Virginia Tech University. He is presently a distinguished member of technical staff at Sandia National Laboratories in the Energy Storage Technology and Systems Department. He leads the Power Electronics subprogram as part of the DOE Energy Storage Program, which has gained international recognition for its state-of-the-art research and development under his leadership. 5 of his projects have won the prestigious R&D 100 Award and 1 Gold Green Energy Award from the Research and Development magazine. His interest in research is power electronics necessary for integrating energy storage and distributed generation with the electric utility grid. Following Dr. Atsidi, we will have a couple of tribal case study presentations. The Chemehuevi Community Center Microgrid case study will have 3 specific presenters who will be introduced here in no particular order. Glenn Lodge is a tribal member and past vice president of the Chemehuevi Indian tribe. He is a senior negotiator for 35 California tribes with the Compact Tribe Steering Committee for Tribal Gaming Compacts. Glenn is a former regional manager for the State of Alaska Department of Labor and as a 23-year member of the U.S. Army Special Forces with 3 tours in Vietnam. Dr. Alfredo Martinez Morales is the managing director of the Southern California Research Initiative for Solar Energy and research professor at the Bourne College of Engineering Center for Environmental Research and Technology. Dr. Martinez Morales received his PhD, Master of Science, and Bachelor's of Science degrees in electrical engineering from UC Riverside. His current research includes solar cells, alkaline metal ion batteries, energy storage, highly integrated renewables, energy storage systems, microgrids, and green hydrogen. Dr. Martinez Morales is a principal investigator in the Sustainable Integrated Grid Initiative at UC Riverside and has contributed in the engineering, permitting, and deployment of the Sustainable Grid Initiative Smart Grid Testbed System in multiple microgrids throughout Southern California. Lisa Castellone is Grid Alternatives Inland Empire Community Development and Tribal Program Manager. Lisa has been responsible for building and promoting Grid Solar Program in the Inland Empire region of California for over 11 years. Lisa has been instrumental in assisting community partners and tribal governments develop their long-term energy goals, identify renewable energy projects, assist with seeking and securing project funding, and implementing renewable energy projects through the Inland Empire region on disadvantaged low-income communities and on 7 tribal reservations. For our final case study, we will hear from Daniel Wiggins Jr. Daniel is a Bad River tribal member and air quality technician in the tribe's Natural Resources Division. In addition to his work as an air quality technician, he has oversight of the tribe's renewable energy activities. Daniel is the project lead for the tribe's recent microgrid project, which installed over 500 kilowatts of solar and 1,000 kilowatt hours of batteries at 3 tribal facilities. The Bad River Tribe's energy projects are planned and executed on the tribe's ability to exercise energy sovereignty and eventually reach the tribe's energy vision, which is to empower and enable the community to move towards energy independence. Thanks to each of our presenters for making the time to join us today. With that, let's get started with our first presentation. Dr. Atsidi, you may proceed once we have your slides up.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you for the introduction, and welcome everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. I'm so excited to be here and to provide some perspectives and an introduction on microgrids and kind of give you some background before we get into some of the case studies. So I appreciate that. I'm originally from, I work at Sandia National Laboratories, and we have multiple laboratories around the nation, And the laboratory I work at is Sandia National Laboratories, which is in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Next slide. We have various locations at Sandia and Kauai. We have Carlsbad, Pentex, and Tonopah. Again, my location is in Albuquerque, and there's a Livermore location also. So, so the next slide. Lots of research happening. So historically, Sandia has been a weapons program since 1945, known as a Z Division, but deal with non-nuclear weapons components. But 1970s, due to the oil embargo, we started focusing on renewable energy research. So this spawned a lot of research in the area of energy, climate, transportation, renewable energy systems. And so my co-author of this presentation is Mr. Mike Roth, Dr. Mike Roth. He's intimately involved in some of the microgrids, IEEE 1547 and others, which I'll mention briefly next in those slides. But he's out of the renewable energy and energy efficiency department, and I primarily operate under the grid and storage systems. Next slide. We focus on energy storage at Sandia, multiple research and development at Sandia, from battery materials to demonstrations to strategic outreach and doing a lot of grid analytics and system analytics. And the area that I'm working on is the power conversion system. I've been overseeing and leading this power conversion system of the overall energy storage system for over 2 decades now. Power conversion systems are a critical piece of equipment that connects the energy storage technology to the grid, and it's a central critical piece of the overall battery energy storage system or energy storage system in general. And that's what I focus on: advanced power electronics, materials, wide band gap, high temperature magnetics and capacitors, and full up systems. So that's where my focus is. My background is power systems, power electronics, and a little bit of electrochemistry. Next slide. We are absolutely grateful for the funding from the DOE Office of Electricity Energy Storage Program. This is a sister organization to DOE Indian Energy Program, and our manager is Dr. Emerjuk, pictured here. Focusing on advancing energy storage technology, systems, and power conversions. We collaborate with industry, universities, and various government entities. We focus on grid-tied and off-grid systems, and working with a number of groups, including tribal. We have a number of tribal projects focused on energy storage. And as you can see from Dr. Juk's quote, he's very fond of working with a tribal entity and pushing on energy sovereignty and looking at some of the benefits of energy storage for tribal community. Next slide. So now we get to the grid. I'm sure you may have heard of this before. The grid is actually the electric utility grid. It is approaching 140 years old. Since the inception northeast of United States, and it started to grow from there to what we have today. And it has multiple voltages. Some of the major transmission systems will have upwards of 765 kilovolts AC, all the way down to 120 volts AC. AC voltages, and of course 120 volts is where we charge our cell phones. That's to that point. So it's a massive system that's across the nation and has lots of power plants, thousands of lines of transmission lines and transformers, relays, controls, and just billions and billions of dollars of investment into this overall system, so we can have power. And this system is sometimes referred to as the macro grid, the macrogrid. And it is challenged right now. As you know, the west side it seems like it's on fire. California, you hear about fires. On the east side, you hear flooding from hurricanes, and then of course we get surprised by some of the polar vortex happening in Texas, cold weather, and of course now the heat on the northwest side, which is incredible. 1 in 1,000-year event. Portland, 108 degrees, impacting some of the transmission systems. And then Vancouver, 105 degrees. It's just incredible what's happening today. So hot weather, loads increase, and it just completely gets impacted and makes it difficult to operate sometimes in some of these regions. So this overall system, power lines that you see driving around the country, that is referred to as the grid or the macro grid. And of course, we have Alaska system also pictured on the bottom right. Next slide. So what is a microgrid? Basically, a microgrid is a smaller version of what you saw earlier. Earlier, it's a mixture of sources and loads. The sources are power plants, coal power plants, nuclear power plants on the macrogrid, that is, and then you have loads and the transmission in between. There's always this balancing between sources and load to make it stable as much as you can. So microgrid is just a smaller version of that, and it can operate connected to the larger grid, the macro grid, or it can operate a standalone mode. These microgrids can vary in size. It could power a few buildings, or they could be large neighborhoods or campuses or military bases. On the right side, you see the bulk power supply connection. That is connected to the macro grid, the big grid. And then you have a disconnect there, ability to, if it's connected, it's connected to the main grid, and it can become disconnected, and then it becomes an islanded mode. And within this, there are various sizes. You could have a full substation microgrid, which encompasses that bigger bubble. And then you could have a full feeder microgrid, a little bit smaller version. And then you could keep going down partial feeder microgrid and all the way down to a single customer microgrid. All those have ability of being tied to the grid or being off grid. So a lot of these microgrids today are formed around combined heat and power plants. These, you see them around, especially when you go to campus. Like, for example, MIT used to have a coal power plant on site, and they migrated to an oil-powered plant, to a natural gas power plant, which they consider the greenest form of fossil fuel. And they produce steam, chill water, electricity, all that. And in 1995, MIT recently went to cogeneration, where you have a combined some of the steam and various versions. Now you can have like heat, electricity, chill water, and all that mixture in there, so at a little bit higher efficiency. So you see these around as you walk campuses, as an example. But what's happening recently is that these microgrids are now more energy storage systems based, combined with renewable energy, solar, wind, and maybe even a small hydro. And they're usually backed up by a like a diesel power generator or whatever form of fuel that they have locally. So that's a microgrid, smaller version of the macro grid. Next slide. Some of the key components of a microgrid will be you have to have generation, your own generation, generators, combined heat and power, renewable and energy storage are examples of a generator, a picture on the right. Energy sinks here are loads, typically loads, residential or industrial loads. You have to have a means of connecting or disconnecting from the larger power system through a point of common coupling. You'll hear that, PCC. It's just an area where the microgrid itself can either connect itself to be grid tied or disconnected would be off-grid mode or islanded mode. You have to have a means for controlling. There's a microgrid controller in there. You have to have a means to figure out how much energy storage you have, for example, generator, how much fuel you have, how is my load looking, am I grid connected, am I off grid connected? Those kind of questions the controller has to ask and act on it. And of course, you have to have some safety assurance here, either via electrical surges and or either a cyber attack that's been talked about these days, and you got to make yourself immune to that to keep power to the residential and critical loads, industrial loads. It also needs to have a black start capability. When the grid goes out, and let's say the microgrid goes out, you have to find a means to start it off. A lot of times, this is missed, I think, because you're trying to start off an inverter or a generator. You need the brains. You need power to the brains. Sometimes you have a UPS to power that controller, so you can figure out how to start things. So that's a big thing. Some type of a backup power to make sure that the brains of the system, the controller system, is operating properly. And then once you get that going, typically it's a generator that's started, usually one of the big sources, and then maybe followed by an energy storage, and then followed by some loads. So very coordinated approach to starting off a microgrid. Most of the time that's done off grid just to make sure you are operating, and everything just starts to get coordinated from there. And then pre-negotiation with the local utility to ultimately get into resynchronization. Let's say the utility grid comes back on, you have to resynchronize. You can't just turn on that switch, the PCC switch, anytime. You have to resynchronize. Otherwise, you have surges and arcs and all sorts of things. You have to be very careful on how to do that. So that's the PCC, and you have to have that black start capability. And you also have to have a surge capability. Some of these loads, like for example, generators, when you turn on a generator, there's high current that can come up. When you start a generator, sometimes 6 to 10 times the rated current can be present. So you have to accommodate that. And then, of course, the voltage and frequency regulation is big. You have to have, the loads, residential loads, industrial loads, they require 60 hertz. Internationally, it's 50 hertz cycles per second. And you have to make sure that you have to keep within those frequency ranges. And anytime there's perturbation between renewable, which is a variable source, it can perturb the system in such a way that you don't want that frequency to become so low or so high, and some of these loads can be very susceptible to that. So you have to be very careful on how you do frequency and voltage regulation. Next slide. Some of the main advantages of a microgrid is that in a macrogrid, what happens is the nuclear power plant or a coal power plant or something, like they're far away, miles away from the load. And there's a lot of losses associated with that. And here we have microgrids that are closer to the loads and in principle less vulnerable to disruption. So if your transmission goes out, whatever, due to storms, if you're supplying the source at the load, you're less susceptible to that. So that's one of the main advantages. The other, there's a lot of reliability enhancements that are taking place installed commercially today. They're really, most microgrids that are installed today are installed for reliability enhancement reason. When the grid goes out, how can I keep my power? And then large-scale mass production of microgrids is another thing that maybe is an advantage. You could have what we call manufactured power systems here, as these renewables are reducing in costs, and energy storage is reducing costs, and you could eventually have a Lego type scenario to where you're doing a cookie cutter of these things, which is really driving the cost down, and standardization and all that. Other potential examples are you could take advantage of local resources. Whatever you have, if you have a strong solar resource, you could take advantage of that depending on your region, maybe a local hydropower. And power is produced locally, like I mentioned earlier. And the other thing is that a lot of these loads can be DC in nature. You could potentially have a DC, take advantage of some of the DC power to the loads. Sometimes there are multiple conversion that takes place, which results in some of the inefficiencies to take AC and then to DC. Like home appliances, some of them, you have to have some power conversion in between, which translates to losses and all that, and you could take advantage of a DC system to go directly to DC rather than have an additional conversion process. So next. There are challenges with microgrids. In general, they can be more expensive when you compare that to the main grid. And here's some of these reasons. You have to have some redundancy to achieve high reliability. Having redundancy meaning that you may have to have two power sources, which automatically the cost goes up times 2. The other thing is some of these systems are built around existing distribution systems, which means some of these will need an upgrade. Of course, upgrade is cost. There's cost consideration there. And the communication system. Some of these microgrids do require high bandwidth network communication to do all the scheduling, balancing the sources and loads and all that. Typical SCADA systems can take data transfer rates can be very, very slow in the tens to seconds to minutes to acquire data, and microgrids need to be much faster in order to do balancing and all that. And then the safety, some safety assurance systems, you have to oversize some of these sources, like oversizing some of the energy storage systems to accommodate what you're trying to do to get the maximum rate of return and all that. So all those relate to cost. And of course, and then you have regulatory hurdles, policy issues. The local utility, due to the monopoly, the utility on the right in the diagram, they are a regulated monopoly over there. So if you're a microgrid asset owner, currently you're forbidden to selling power to another customer because the utility is a monopoly. You're forbidden to do that. However, you could establish with a special arrangement with a local utility to sell some of the power to the utility, and they themselves sells to their customers. That can be possible. It could be a nice benefit for the tribes there, financial benefit to the tribe, and that could be a localized, equitable means of for business development for the tribe. So be mindful of that. Next slide. The future of microgrids. Public perception is very, very strong. Anytime they get their power disrupted due to fires, whatever, it's very strong. And the politicians and all that, they start to listen when the masses come and say, what is going on? So, some examples of the recent outages due to California, which I've mentioned earlier, now the heat wave in the Northwest, and then polar vortex, and then the flooding, as you can see, the flooding there in Texas, some of the distribution system underwater. And then the other thing is, the grid operators usually exclude major events in their reliability matrix. This kind of hides the impact of some of the major events, true reliability. So, and the major events is usually not calculated in that. So it's kind of interesting how that's all calculated. But So anyway, load side generation can definitely improve reliability and resiliency. That's becoming common. But most of them are not true microgrids because they do not have an on-grid mode. It's just purely backup mode and not grid interactive mode. So there are two things that's going to depend on the future. Microgrids, you know, the cost advantage of having an on-grid mode. The blue sky event, how good is that for you? The blue sky event is, you know, boy, we have this microgrid. How is that a benefit? And you've negotiated with the utility grid. How is that a big benefit? You know, is that cost effective for us? You know, is that in a scenario, is that is this a good place for a microgrid? And then, of course, you know, can you share some of your resources with other to the customers? But again, I mentioned regulatory hurdle there. You know, if those things, policies change and regulatory changes, and then I think that's going to spawn a lot of interesting control philosophies and implementation of additional microgrids. But you know, sometimes those things are hard to get around. Okay, next slide. We do some research in microgrids, and some of the questions that we do ask the question of where do you place them? Where do you place these small power systems? There is a method that is used by Sandia. There's a process that we go through getting infrastructure data on a system, let's say on a tribe. Where's the hospital? Where's the gas station? Where's a sewage system, hotels, and all that? And then the threat analysis. The threat analysis is things like for the tribal region, for example, is a potential for flooding, 110, 500-year flooding. Is there a potential for high wind speeds and landslide and earthquakes? And now, you know, the high heat index could be another threat analysis that one does. So combined with the infrastructure data and threat analysis, you can start to determine where the best place would be. For example, there's an analysis done at Puerto Rico. On the left side are some of the threats. You see the top flood zone and landslide susceptibility, for example. You can develop a map which shows the green areas on that map, which turns out to be a Ponce, if you're familiar with the Puerto Rico island. There's an area on the middle southern part of Puerto Rico. The green area is the favorable parts of a microgrid that would be based on all the infrastructure data and threat analysis. So you can kind of pinpoint where these microgrids are best suited for to give the best value to the people and resources economically and also for resiliency. So the bottom one is just an analytical method. If you have cost versus burden. Burden is actually, let's say you're far from a hospital compared to somebody who's close to a hospital. The burden from the person who's far from the hospital is high, and the person next to the hospital is lower. So the burden, you know, you kind of have to take that into account. Of course, money. If you have tons of money, you could have microgrids all over the place. But if you don't have that, you can optimize that and the plot to where you want to be as a low burden, but a reasonable cost. And then you can pinpoint where the microgrids would be. So Bobby Jeffers is actually doing a lot of analysis in this region. So thought I'd mention that. Next slide. And there is an example here, microgrid, a good example. And you guys have all heard about this before in the previous review, Indian energy reviews and other meetings. So I'm not going to belabor this, but you know, there are lots of examples out there, and this is a good one. This is actual functioning, secure and reliable low carbon microgrid on Blue Lake Rancheria site. I've actually visited the site and they're doing lots of things. Of course, they're designated an American Red Cross evacuation center. And just doing lots of dispatching of optimal dispatching of batteries and sources and loads and all that. So a functioning system. So they're out there. Next slide. Let me give you another one. I just want to pinpoint this example here. This is Island Lanai. If you visited Hawaii, it's one of the island, as you can see on the map on the left side. You'll see the Lanai there. So it's one of the smaller islands, but bigger picture on the right. They have both sources and loads, and they have resorts and airport and a bunch of different loads there. And they have generation and PV. So next slide, please. So on site, they have diesel generators and Caterpillar diesel generators on site. There are 6 of them and 2 of the Caterpillar. And the folks on the island thought it'd be a good idea to implement a renewable energy source also along with the diesel generator. These are 1950s diesel generators. And they actually installed a PV plant, as shown on the bottom there, 1.2 megawatt PV plant. And it's great, located near the generators. However, you see the sheep picture right there. Notice what's on top. They're cloud formation. There's a snake-like cloud formation every single day. And guess where it covers? The PV plant. So the bottom right is a power production from a PV plant. The left side is the power, and the x-axis is the time. So so you don't want these jagged edge power like shown here. You want a smoother waveform, but this is what happens. And the jagged power just drops out, and that's not good for the generator. The generator has a response time, and it doesn't like those quick drop in power. And what happens is the generator has to respond to that. And the generator is trying to keep the 60 cycles per second, but what happens is the pumps on the island, they're very susceptible to the frequency, the 60 cycles per second. And if it perturbs beyond there, either high or low, they go offline. And now the residents are not happy because of photovoltaic system. So next slide. And I won't belabor this, but what we did was we studied the system and we introduced energy storage, and rather than a step function, we use energy storage as a ramp function, and that way the generator operates much better. So this is analogous to, my uncle used to have an old vehicle, and with old shocks. He hits a bump on a reservation, and the car just oscillates back and forth. It takes time to finally dampen. And finally, my uncle will have some money, and he'll put some brand new shocks on there. And the shocks, once you put a brand new shock, and then you hit that same bump, and it's just the oscillation does not stay there long. It just dampens pretty quick. So in a sense, what we're doing is we're implementing an energy storage system. An electric shock absorber is what we're introducing into this oscillating system. So now the pumps are now within range. They don't go offline. And now the renewable system is actually a really good system now. So as a result of the study. So just want to mention that. So the point of this is that, yes, renewable and all that stuff are great. And, low CO2 and resiliency and all that stuff, climate change and all that stuff. But you have to be very careful when you implement that it may have a negative effect on your system. So you have to, that's where energy storage becomes a real big thing. So anyway, next slide. Just real quickly, we have under the energy storage program, we have, we're working with 5 different tribes and 6 projects with the Navajo Nation. We have 2 projects with Navajo Nation, the Picaries tribe, San Carlos tribe, and Seminole and Levelock Village of Alaska. So we have working with 5 different tribes under the energy storage program. So I just thought I'd put a mention of that, that we are actively working with the tribes in addition to what the Office of Indian Energy is doing. So that is my last slide, and I'll stop there.
Thanks, Dr. Atsubi. Excellent presentation, a lot of interesting stuff there. We do have some questions that have been submitted that we'll take at the end of all the presentations. And to our audience, do continue to ask questions, because we'll likely have some time for them at the end here. We're going to get on to our next Sorry, did you have something? Okay, we'll go on to our next presentation here, the Chemehuevi case study. Mr. Lodge, I'm going to unmute you now, as well as all of our other presenters for this case study. So you can go.
Thank you, James. I'm gonna kick off the presentation, and then Lisa will speak a little bit, and then Glenn. Next slide, please. Yeah, so there is quite a bit of information that we want to cover this morning or this afternoon. And some of the material we're gonna discuss at a very high level, but we wanted to, kind of outline some of the approach. Hello, James, can you hear me?
Yes, you sound good.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I heard something. So we wanna describe the approach that the university, in partnership with the Chemehuevi tribe and the CEC and Grid Alternatives, took in terms of deploying a demonstration and deployment project. We'll discuss some of the project results, the benefits, and some of the lessons that we learned. Next slide, please. So this project was funded by the CEC as part of the EPIC program. On this slide, we can see the various project partners that were part of the project. This project, because of its applied research nature, had a lot of complexities in terms of the technology being demonstrated, some of the interconnection requirements, the performance of technology. And so I think it makes for a very good case study in terms of microgrid systems in Native American tribal lands. The intent of the project was to manage energy use profiles and provide resiliency to the Chemehuevi Community Center, which is a response center for the tribe. The microgrid system was composed or is composed of 90 kilowatts of solar PV. And in its first phase, it included a 25 kilowatt, 125 kilowatt hour flow battery. The other components that are part of the microgrid include a data historian, an advanced control system developed by the university, and a series of energy management strategies. Next slide, please. So in terms of the motivation, as we have discussed was discussed in other of the previous webinars, when we're dealing with Native American tribes, a lot of times they're mostly in a remote location, and there's a single line of power distribution powering those communities. So they're extremely susceptible to power outages and downtime maintenance. It has been understood and demonstrated in other case studies that microgrids are ideal for providing resiliency to critical facilities within remote communities. But there's still a need for successful demonstration, particularly when you're thinking about pre-commercial technologies, right? So there is the need to demonstrate that in addition to providing resiliency, you can also provide other benefits to the communities. And so as we look at ways to not only increase resiliency, but also provide other benefits to tribes, new technologies are coming up, with very unique approaches in terms of, well, how do you do the power conversion? How do you integrate different sources of energy? How do you manage the load so that you can, optimize the utilization of the energy in the local resources? Next slide, please. So in this project, we had a series of goals that we wanted to demonstrate. First of all, we wanted to look at various energy management strategies, including peak reduction, load shifting, demand response, and load control. There was a requirement to lower electricity bills in terms of reducing the power demand by more than 10% of the daily average energy demand during peak times. We also wanted to demonstrate that we can manage in a smart way the loads, particularly the HVAC within the community center, the self-consumption of the PV, and also the daily cycling of the battery to support, the energy load profiles. We also wanted to improve the resiliency by addressing and preventing, power disruptions and mitigating the impact of those power disruptions, as well as managing critical loads in the case of a power disruption event. Next slide, please. There were several anticipated project benefits that we identified. These benefits span over 20 years since some of the components, for example, the solar PV system, has a lifetime of 25 years. A lot of the benefits that are anticipated from microgrid projects, in addition to resiliency, have to do with the economics in terms of lowering energy cost. Since this was a research and deployment demonstration type of project, we're very interested in improving the data acquisition and the energy management capabilities of the microgrid. We wanted to increase the grid stability, robustness, and reliability of the system and the community center, while also decreasing the local, greenhouse gas emissions that were generated through the use of a diesel backup generator that was already in existence at the community center. The project provided great opportunity for workforce development activities and also to develop some best practices in terms of how to work closely with Native American tribes and, in partnership with, nonprofits and also, technology providers. We wanted to demonstrate that these partnerships can actually be very helpful in terms of fostering relationships between the private and public entities, but also to de-risk these technologies, right? So microgrids in concept have been around for a long time. As Stan indicated, a lot of times, they do have, they came in the form of a system that included a diesel backup generator. But there's an interest in terms of moving away from the emissions of greenhouse gases and also using fossil fuels. But a lot of times the solutions that are currently available, they're not well demonstrated, so there's quite a bit of hesitation from the end user to be one of the first projects that engages and demonstrates a particular technology. Next slide, please. At this point, I would like to pass the floor to Lisa. She can speak about grid alternatives, who they are, the type of work they do, and also the involvement that they had in this project. Lisa?
Thank you, Alfredo, and hello, everybody. Very honored to be here and sharing this information with you all. These are some slides about the actual project and construction of the project. Grid is a leading voice for low-income solar policy and the nation's largest nonprofit, bringing solutions to communities and volunteer and training to implement this energy in disadvantaged communities across the country. And we have offices throughout California, Colorado, Atlantic, and we serve over 43 tribal nations across the US. So we are involved in renewable energy projects, and we were very honored to be a part of this project. We had a long-standing partnership with the Chemehuevi tribe. We were doing residential projects, and UCR and Grid, we came together to the Chemehuevi tribe for this project because Grid also implements hands-on job training. And the beauty of this project was that this particular reservation has extreme heat. And as Alfredo said, it's at the end of a transmission line, lots of power disruption. And this project was going to really offer some relief to the community. And so for Grid to be a part of it and bringing our triple bottom line, which is the people, the planet, and the employment to the reservation, it was a real good fit. We had already been a trusted partner, and we were brought in to do the construction and also to work with some of the folks there and train, and not just come in and do it for the project, but to involve community members on the reservation to help with this. So it's actually this learning model. So it was this is one of the shots of the construction. And next slide, please. So with the job training model that was very attractive to the tribe and to the UCR, where we're actually training folks. We do provide hands-on training. We do classroom and installations out on the field. We have a program set up. We have several programs set up for our job training philosophy. Trainees learn while participating on real-world installations. And in this case, we were training in the field, and we're partnering with the tribe on this long-standing partnership. We have partnered with colleges across the country and been working with the Chemehuevi tribe and the trainees out there for several years, working on the single-family side of things. And this is a shot from some of the folks that were out there working. Mind you, it was really hot. Very far away. So working on the reservation with trainees right there on their facility was really, it's a great partnership to have part of this program. So next slide, please. And here's a couple of other shots, and you can see the Lake Havasu there in the background, and the process of how the installation was going. And so I wanted to share that we were doing the construction part of it with the job training, and that was our focus of this project. And I wanted to introduce Glenn from the tribe, as he will have more to say about our partnership and the trust factor of working in relation with Grid Alternatives and the whole project in general. So with that, Glenn.
Can you hear me, Lisa?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. I want to thank everybody for attending this morning and providing us the opportunities to speak about microgrids as a whole and how they really apply and the value of them to national Indian tribes. Now, we are a small tribe of about 1,100 members, and we're located on the Lake Havasu, Havasu Lake, Arizona border, and we're in the Mojave Desert. Conditions here are very, very extreme. This last week, we went through about 7 days of 120 plus degree heat every day. As I sit here this morning, it's about 103 already. How does this really relate? Well, you know, prior to this microgrid and the solar installations for the homes here, we depend primarily on the main utility grid. And since we are in the far reaches of our local utilities energy system, we sometimes suffer through, or really used to, not as much anymore, but as much as 4 or 5 days at a time without power because of the age of the infrastructure that supports the power grid out here. This project was really designed to give us more resiliency and associated cost savings for our energy needs out here. And as Lisa and Alfredo both spoke earlier, our community center area provide shelter during these long-term power outages, where especially in the summer, where we need to get our seniors and our young children out of the heat and into an area that has that is supported by a program such as the Microgrid program to provide power, where during emergencies it becomes critical. We worked through a collaboration with Alfredo said, a grant program through California Energy Commission, UC Riverside, and Grid Alternatives, who have been a long time partner with us to try to ramp up solar power here on our own reservation. So we're ideally suited to these type of projects in that we probably have over 300 sun days a year. So the project was very viable. This initial project that we started with the UC Riverside was a 90 kilowatt project to provide resiliency to our community center, primarily because of the emergency situations we find ourselves in from time to time. I think this is a very good, very viable program for all tribes, but especially for the most remotest of tribes, that you're so far away from the main source of the power grid that during times of extreme conditions, at least we have something to fall back on. Well, I'd just like to say one other thing. One of our goals in building this project was to develop a program that is duplicable for almost anyone else, any other tribal or small community entity that's looking at microgrids. So I think that's one of the great benefits of this program, is that, thank you for changing that slide, is that it can be duplicated across the country. And I really think it is the future of microgrids in the United States. I've worked with Lisa Castellone for, I want to say, probably 7 years now, maybe a little longer, in getting a foothold in the solar energy for our tribe. This prior to working with UC Riverside. UC Riverside is a very dedicated organization, as is Grid Alternatives. And it was really a work in progress for quite a while before we were able to fine tune it enough to really bring it online and make it work for our tribe. The end result is that we did work through all those problems at the tribal level and at the technical level, and we're able to construct a system that continues to support our needs to this day. And I'm looking forward to developing other programs here on our reservation, either commercial or microgrid. We're looking at all forms or all sizes of projects to support our power needs here in the Lower Mojave Basin. So that's all I have for right now. I'd just like to encourage any of the other tribes that are out there that may be listening to pursue these projects, because there is funding available. It may be on a competitive basis, but it's very worthwhile for your time and the energy that you're going to put in to trying to get a project built. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Glenn. Can we advance to the next slide, please? Yeah. So the major takeaway from this slide is that when you look at the Chemehuevi tribe, you can see that in terms of the reliability indexes, they're very high compared to the SCE system wide, and even compared to San Bernardino district, right? So certainly a microgrid was a very viable and very good option in terms of providing local resiliency to the community. Next slide, please. In terms of the general approach, the first step was to do a baseline analysis to determine, what were the needs of the community. The analysis is helpful in terms of providing guidance for the development of control algorithms, right? The purpose of the control algorithm is to come up with a series of steps and ways to manage the local resources in the most optimal way, not only in terms of providing the resiliency that the microgrid can provide, but also trying to maximize the economic benefits, right? And so data collection, data analysis were very heavy in terms of pre and post deployment of the microgrid. Next slide, please. One important aspect when we're looking at providing electrical savings is to get a good understanding of the rate schedule and the electricity bill. In this graph, we can see that, looking at a span of about 3 years, we can actually see a couple things, right? So we can see that within the existing rate schedule, there is a summer, period, there's a winter period, there is a facility demand charge that is applied throughout the year. There is also some fixed charges, but at least in this specific case, we can see that there's a down trend in terms of the energy consumption over the years from 2015 to 2018. And so this is helpful in terms of trying to optimize what the appropriate size of the solar generation should be to satisfy the needs of the community center, and also perhaps to take into account improvements in terms of energy efficiency, as well as future plans for the community in terms of supporting other activities for the tribal members. Next slide, please. So this block diagram here, without going into too many of the details, right? We can see on the left the solar PV system. We can see below the battery system. In the middle, within the green rectangle, is the power conversion system, which includes the GID, the grid isolation device, which is needed to connect and disconnect from the utility. Within the broken line, those are the components developed by UC Riverside in terms of the data analytics, some of the optimization to manage the resources, as well as the control algorithms, right? And in this particular case, one of the main aspects that we helped manage in terms of the loads was the HVAC within the facility. Next slide, please. So here are some photos of what the major components of the microgrid are in terms of the solar PV. There are 2 arrays. As I mentioned, this was a research project. So one aspect that we were very interested in was looking at the performance of different types of solar panels. So we use 2 different series from the SunPower family of products. One is denoted at the time as a premium panel. The other was considered to be a more cost-effective solution for customers, right? And so one of the aspects that we looked into was, okay, how well do the 2 panels compare to each other, given the extreme heat conditions that you experience at the tribe. On the right, there's a photo of the weather station, which helps to monitor some of the data that is important for us to perform efficiency calculations in terms of solar production, as well as some of the prediction that we wanted to do as part of the project. Next slide, please. This is a photo that shows the flow battery. The flow battery is it's a very unique technology in the sense that, in addition to providing a very life cycle in the 30,000 cycles, it also allows for achieving 100% full depletion of the battery. So you have the ability to fully drain the battery on a continuous basis without affecting the efficiency or the system itself over its lifetime. So that was one aspect that was very unique to this project, looking at this flow battery and trying to get a better understanding on how well it performs, and also some opportunities for improving the system itself. Next slide, please. Another very unique aspect for this project had to deal with the power conversion component. On the left, we have a DC to DC conversion unit. This unit allowed for the connection of different type of DC sources. So you could connect the different arrays from the solar PV system into those drawers without having to be too concerned about matching voltage levels. On the right, we have the AC to DC inverter, which was responsible for providing power to the center, and in the middle, that's a photo of the grid isolation disconnect, which allowed for the disconnect and resynchronization to the grid after this power disruption event. Next slide, please. The energy management system used the OSI South Pi system in order to collect and perform a lot of the analytics. We had the ability to monitor the different HVACs, to integrate the data values of interest from the solar PV system, the battery system, the weather station. So it allowed a very nice way to integrate multiple sources of data in order for us to be able to observe and monitor things closely. Next slide, please. This graph here shows an example of 3 days where we show the charging and discharging of the battery. The orange line, it's the solar production. As Glenn mentioned, the Chemehueve gets many sunny days, and fortunately, most of the time they're not cloudy. So you can see these very nice curves in terms of the solar production. The blue line represents the battery charging or discharging. Below the zero line indicates charging at a constant rate. Above the zero line represents discharging, during the hours of the high price of energy, right? So we were on peak pricing. That's when we use the battery to support some of those loads within the community center. And the green line basically is just what the SCE or the utility meter sees in terms of the power import from the utility to the community center. Next slide, please. Another example here, looking at a comparison between using the battery versus not using the battery. One of the aspects of benefit in terms of economic benefits has to deal with peak reduction, right? So within the rate schedule and the electricity bill, there is a charge for the amount of kilowatts that you import from the utility company. So in this case, one aspect to reduce the cost is by using the battery to reduce that peak. And so on the left, we show that without the battery, there would be a peak in the range of 30 kilowatts. And then with the use of the battery, that peak can be reduced to below 20 kilowatts, right? So in this particular case, the reduction is not huge, but when you think about all the possibilities in terms of larger systems and also multiple systems across a distribution network, then that's fairly significant. Next slide, please. Here a little bit more detail in terms of the controlled automation of the microgrid system, right? So the microgrid has an energy management system that basically manages all the different components. So this This graph is intended to show the charging, discharging, and also something unique to the battery technology that was demonstrated, which is a refresh cycle. So a self-cleaning cycle to ensure that energy capacity can be maintained over, full cycles. Next slide, please. Looking at the project results, this graph here shows the PV generation as well as the building consumption. It can be seen that those values below the zero line represent exporting power to the utility company, right? So over a 12-month period, 143,000 kilowatt hours of AC renewable energy were produced, which displays a significant amount of CO2 equivalent greenhouse gas emissions, right, in the tune of more than 47,000 kilograms. One aspect that it's indicated here is that even though the microgrid is intended to provide support and economic benefit to the utilities, there are some considerations in terms of making sure that you have a close monitoring, you have the ability to closely monitor the system, because in practice, you are going to see that the system may come down for some unexpected reason, right? So for example, if there's an issue in the data communication, then you cannot communicate with it, and then it cannot do its intended purpose. There's also cases where, because of the extreme conditions within the location, there could be components within the equipment that could fail or not work properly. So there are some considerations from a practical perspective that we need to keep in mind. Next slide, please. Yeah, so here we show the savings that were achieved over a 12-month period, right? So there's about a savings of more than $11,000, representing about a 50% reduction from the average annual electricity cost, right, when comparing against the baseline of 3 years. And in addition to those savings, there was also a little bit of benefit from the participation in the CPP demand response program, right? So this is a program where the utility will make a request for participants to reduce their demand response on a specific day during a specific hours of the day. And if you participate, then there's a compensation of X dollars per kilowatt that is reduced, right? So in the case of the Chemehuevi, participating in that program, brought up about $500 of additional economic benefit. Next slide, please. So here's another benefit, it's to the community, but also to the utility company, right? So microgrids have the ability to curtail some of the power demand by using the local resources, whether it's the solar generation or the energy stored within a battery system. But here we can see that one of the original targets was to reduce 10% of the demand peak of the baseline, and so here we see that over a year there was a 69 kilowatt reduction that was achieved, right? So again, 69 kilowatt does not seem to be a very large reduction, but when you think about the future of the grid in terms of distributed energy resources, each one of those systems individually providing relief to the grid, and then more importantly, communicating and coordinating with each other to actually have a huge impact in the future in terms of providing support and increasing reliability and resiliency of the grid. Next slide, please. So looking into the benefits, financial benefits, definitely something that most end users or system owners are very interested in, right? So does the project pans out? The savings are achieved in terms of electricity, consumption, in terms of electrical demand, and also, demand response participation. But there are other benefits that can be achieved through this project, right? So for example, reducing some of those local emissions from the usage and maintenance of diesel backup generators, providing greater, resiliency and reliability to a local resource in the community, like the community center, right? Also taking the opportunity to develop opportunities for the residents or the members of the tribe to get some hands-on training, potentially allowing them to join a workforce that is in the uprise, right? So solar energy and these type of technologies are growing very fast, right? And so there's the need for experienced and qualified personnel to join. In terms of the other benefit is again the de-risking of these technologies, right? Nobody likes to be the first one to demonstrate something because there's quite a bit of risk involved. But as Glenn said, Chemehuevi, having gone through this experience in partnership with UCR and GRID and the CEC, we have a very good understanding on what are some of the technical and practical challenges that can be faced by tribes when they go into these projects, right? So I think this project ultimately does help other tribes or other communities to take a closer look at some of these projects and feel more confident that the risk has been lower and they have someone that they can approach if they need some help or guidance. Next slide, please. So in terms of the lessons learned, there were at various different aspects, right? So in terms of the construction, well, there's a need to have a close oversight and coordination, right? Especially because in our case, we were looking at the integration of pre-commercial technologies. So we needed to also have on-site support. So some aspect of local training was needed. Permitting, when you look at microgrids, is usually a challenge, right? Because in addition to the utility company, you also have to deal with the authority having jurisdiction, right? And so depending on the project site, this could be the tribe, or this could be a county, or this could be a city, right? And a lot of times the requirements or the local requirements can change significantly from one jurisdiction to the other, right? There's also, especially for tribes, there are some considerations in terms of, what are the applicable, environmental laws, whether you're dealing with NEPA or CEQA or there's, anything else that you must consider, right? So commissioning is one of those aspects where you need to interconnect the system with the utility company. And interconnection is not only a challenging process, especially when you're dealing with a jurisdiction that has limited experience, and it can take several months to complete. So one very important aspect that we have learned to consider very early on is the steps necessary for that interconnection agreement, right? And part of the interconnection agreement requires you that you are fully compliant with the interconnection requirements, which in some cases can be, fairly challenging. Next slide, please. So there is some very specific site requirements. There are, microgrids. There is no single solution that works for all communities, right? And so it is very important to have a clear understanding of what are the local needs, and also make sure that the technical specifications of the system components and the technology that is to be deployed, it's consistent within the expected operating conditions or environmental conditions of the site, right? So you need to think carefully where that site is going to be constructed, or where the system is going to be sited, because some of these decisions can have an impact in the future in terms of the performance, in terms of how fast the system will age, in terms of perhaps even failure, early failure or premature failure of the system, right? In the engineering side, there's quite a bit of work that needs to be done on the technical aspect, but also the gathering of all the necessary documents. It's important, right? In some cases, that's a challenge because smaller tribes may not have recent records of some of the documents that are needed. So there's the need to carry out newer studies, or sometimes things are misplaced, and so I mean. Gathering documentation and keeping track of documents is very important. And then in terms of the equipment procurement, we'll just have to make sure that whatever you purchase, it's gonna meet the requirements for the interconnection agreement. So it's important to understand what those requirements are from the very beginning. Next slide, please. So in terms of the demonstration, you need to keep a close eye to the system, right? Because systems do fail, right? This is unfortunately it's a reality, right? Where even a small component can actually create some failure within a system. So you got to be able to look carefully and on a continuous manner to the system to make sure that it's working properly. You need to have local support at the community to respond depending on what the needs of the project are. So, you need to also identify local subcontractors that can provide that support when it goes beyond, normal and standard type of maintenance activities. In terms of sustainability, you have to look beyond the project timeline, right? So for example, in our case, this being a 5-year project, it's important to consider what happens after, the project reaches its end, right? And the project goes from the CEC to Chemehuevi, and how do you support it and maintaining for the next 15 plus years, right? So these are important things to consider. Even in the case where you have support for the full lifetime of the system, you also have to consider some aspects in terms of the decommissioning of that system, right? So if you decommission the system at the end of this lifetime, then what do you do with the panels? What do you do with the batteries? How do you recycle? How do you properly dispose of those components, right? So these are considerations that are important to look into, as part of the project. Next slide, please. Yeah, so here, these are a little bit more specific to the research aspects of the project, right? In terms of the integration of the various components and also the management and the control. But I think the takeaway from this slide is that having a strong partnership is very important, right? So, for example, as Glenn and Lisa, mentioned, a partnership, between Chemehuevi, Grid, the university, and the CEC is very important because, it allows for the successful completion and management of projects, even when there are challenges, right? These projects will have challenges, and it's important that your partners can support you and provide, resolve the issues as they come up. Next slide, please. So yeah, coming back to the importance of local jurisdictions and also being able to satisfy requirements for interconnection. I think in the interest of time, I'm going to move to the next slide, please. Just very briefly, this is what the single line diagram of the original microgrid system looked like, right? So it shows the solar PV, it shows the battery system, it shows the backup diesel generator, the grid isolation disconnect or device, the communication that is part of the microgrid. Can we move on to the next slide, please? There were some challenges that we faced on this project. One critical challenge is that one of the companies that provided the power conversion components went out of business. And when they went out of business, even though the system was functioning well, we were in a very delicate situation where if there was a failure of that component, then the microgrid was not going to be functional anymore. So what we decided to do in a strategic manner was to replace that particular component and reconfigure the microgrid so that we will be secure and confident that the microgrid could continue to function even after the end of the project. If we move to the next slide, we'll see that the microgrid was reconfigured, moving away from the power conversion unit, the matrix, into solar edge, solar inverters, which are more traditional and more reliable in terms of the company being more bankable and also having a good track record. We also decided to move away from the flow battery, mostly because once we disconnected the matrix, we needed to reconfigure some of the aspects of the system, and so we felt at the time that it was probably a better choice to go into a battery system that is more traditional, like in the case of a lithium-ion battery. Next slide, please. So since we replaced some of those components, the solar inverter, the battery inverter controller, and the battery itself, we also were able to obtain some of the services that are provided through these vendors has a benefit to the customer. Can we move on to this next slide, please? And we'll see that, for example, in the case of the solar PV inverters, Solar Edge provides this very user-friendly type of interface that allows to look at the system in terms of its production, in terms of how it's performing. Also look at some of the environmental conditions like the weather. The next slide will show us that a similar type of interface is provided by the battery energy provider Socomec, where you can actually look at the various components of the microgrid, the solar, the battery, the grid isolation component, the loads, right, and get a fairly good assessment in terms of how well and the status of the system is. If we move on to the next slide, we'll see just a very simple, charge discharge battery testing cycling, right? This was performed as part of the commissioning of the second battery system, and on the right we can see the islanding operation of the microgrid, right? So we can see that the orange line represents the grid coming from the utility, the grid power coming from the utility. And we show that if we disconnect the microgrid and go into an islanding mode, we can actually support the loads within the community center. And so that was these two, experiments, controlled experiments, were performed as part of the commissioning of the second microgrid architecture. Next slide, please. At this point, I would like to thank our partners, right? We started with a very large group of people. Some companies left the marketplace. So ultimately, we ended up, with the companies that are listed on this slide. And the next photo shows the team that we have at the community. I'm in the center. My colleague is to my right, and then Glenn is to my left, with Lori and Manuel on the back. So everybody were, the Chemehuevi team was extremely supportive, right? And so we're very glad that we're able to pull the project off. And this photo here shows the ribbon cutting ceremony with some representatives from the CEC, as well from SCE and the utility and the technology companies, including Grid. That is the last slide that we have this morning. Thank you, and yeah, happy to answer some questions at the end of the next talk. Thank you.
And
Thanks, Alfredo.
If I may, before we move on to questions, I just wanted to give Glenn another opportunity to be unmuted to see if he had anything else to add to our presentation.
Well, thank you, Lisa. I just like to say, you know, it's been a pleasure working with our partners, and we look forward to bigger and better things down the road. Lord knows that we have the conditions and the topography to support these systems, and it's been a real educational process for our tribal members, learning what really is viable out here and how we can become more self-sustaining. So our partners have made this possible for us. Thank you.
Thanks, Glenn. Thanks, Lisa and Alfredo. We have one last presentation, and then we'll have time for questions, hopefully. Depends on how fast we go. Daniel, it looks like your slides are up, so let's proceed.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, James. I'll kind of make sure there's time for questions. Great presentations, and I can definitely see there being some great questions at the end of this. So getting right into it. Hello, my name is Daniel Wiggins. I'll be presenting on behalf of the Bad River Band of Lake Superior Tribe of Chippewa Indians, and talking about my special microgrid project. Just to give you a little, you know, pointer where we're at. We are located in northern Wisconsin, as far north as you can get on the beautiful southern shores of Lake Superior. So we have great shores, great location. Some may question the sun because we have long winters, but hey, we get about a month or two of summers up here. So next slide. This just goes over what I'm going to present. So again, I'm just going to highlight, you know, really how we got into our project. I think the other two presentations did a great job going into like the dynamics of microgrids and kind of the policies, you know, the issues with developing, the issues with executing, you know, all of these obstacles in the way. You know, so I'll try to stray from a lot of that and just get into, you know, why Bad River did this and maybe why we chose microgrids and stuff essentially. So next slide. Just to give you a little bit of details about some of the objectives. A lot of renewable energy work is triggered from years and years of planning. So feasibility studies, energy audits and stuff. So nothing just started yesterday or the year before. A lot of this stuff started back in 2007. And then it just builds and builds and builds. And then eventually you find that moment to kind of execute a project. Our moment was the US DOE grant. And when we were awarded in 2019, we were able to kind of execute one of our microgrid projects, you know, and thoughts. So without it, it definitely wouldn't have happened. There was other things that contributed to why a microgrid, really focusing on resiliency after the 2016 flood that northern Wisconsin had, and that the Bad River tribe really was in the middle of experiencing and had some really, really specific circumstances that triggered why microgrids. Specifically, the tribe installed over 500 kW of solar with over 1,000 kilowatt hours of battery storage at 3 tribal facilities. We'll go into why we picked those facilities and then really get into the systems at the Health and Wellness Center and the wastewater treatment plant, which can offset the facility loads and provide a level of resiliency that can last days, if not weeks. Next slide. So just get it in, you know, 2016 flood. Not everybody's from Wisconsin, and I think everybody, you know, there's different reasons why we choose microgrids. Weather events is definitely one of them. So beyond that, we have a utility that we are also on a radio line. You've heard another tribe say, hey, we got a line that just comes to a dead end. Same here with us. So what that means is when you get power outages, everyone else down the line gets them all the time. So we get them very often, and then with weather events, we kind of realized that we were getting, you know, quite a few outages during some specific weather events can last, you know, quite a long time. Health and Wellness Center, their road you're looking at, was basically taken out, and the yellow lines are some of the utility lines going into the buildings. Just another thought, but you know, it did affect medical and emergency supplies and stuff being lasted throughout that event. Oh, go ahead, you can change slides. This is just some other pictures, just showing the extent of flooding. These are main roads. This is one of the major communities within the tribe. So completely underwater. Tribal members who are familiar with power grounds, if you look on the northern part, there's a little circle. Those are our power grounds, completely underwater. So next slide. This is our Highway 2. So this is a Highway 2 that goes right through the northern threats. Just again, showing the extent. We were completely cut off from resources both east and west. This highway is basically the in and out to the reservation. Next slide. This is a project timeline, so just wanted to give you a brief scope of kind of how this progressed. You know, again, this just doesn't start in an incubator in an office somewhere. Goes into years of planning, feasibility studies first of all. But I did want to target the specific event that, you know, triggered this microgrids. The July flood, after that did come some strategic energy planning, and then also the tribe adopted an emergency preparedness plan. That specifically is what identified the critical infrastructure and also identified microgrids as a possibility to mitigate some of those emergency planning measures. So those two documents combined with this, you know, the strategic energy plan obviously gives you the avenue to the feasibility studies of solar, wind, microgrids, biomass, and so on. So, you know, all of that goes into play, and then basically from 2019, from being awarded and into 2020, we basically executed the project. Next slide. So getting into some of the project details, go ahead, next slide already. You can see that we did target one community. A Dueno community is kind of the center. We call it capital. In other words, I don't think tribes have capitals, but if you did, this probably could be it. Has our government buildings, wastewater treatment plant, has our health facilities, community centers, just a number of facilities centered within the tribe. We targeted 3 buildings, again, using the emergency preparedness plan, and just really using that as guidance to really push the project forward. This is just giving you an outlay of where they lie within the community, I guess. Next slide. The administration building is our main government building. So you're gonna see a lot of offices in there. It is one of the suggested places for when we have emergencies, that it is the center location for emergency response. This has a 24 kW DC solar panel generation inverter with a battery storage of 10 kW and 20 kilowatt hours. Pushes excess energy back to the building, and grid forming capabilities in the event of a utility outage. Batteries do charge on excess solar. Next slide. Just a couple pictures of what this looks like. So we have some solar panels right on the building when you drive in. The battery escape module is in the back, kind of hidden away, but hey, we know where to see it. The guys who are responsible know where to look. Wastewater treatment plant. This is a very, very unique system. Both the next two systems are very unique and exciting. This is a 200 kW DC solar panel generation, 250 kW AC inverter, battery storage capacity of 200 kW with 426 kilowatt hours, pushes excess energy back to the building and grid, does not form a grid in the event of a utility outage. Wastewater treatment plants are very unique, and they have a lot of pumps, they have a lot of equipment, and they have a lot of things. So we do rely on the generator a little bit more than this next microgrid I'm going to show you. Batteries do charge on the excess solar. Just some pictures of showing you how the wastewater treatment plant kind of progressed. So started out as a field with the solar panels, built them, that's the battery pack and installed. Next slide. And that's kind of the end product. So in the way back corner on the left-hand side, you can see the wastewater treatment plant. We did have to put this across the street in kind of the field that could support a 200 kW PV system, but definitely had the space and worked out beautiful. It's one of a very beautiful array and just location in general. Next slide. The Health and Wellness Center, definitely our largest microgrid out of the three, and just very cool. I think that's all you can say about some of these microgrids. They're just so cutting edge. I think it's just exciting to hear about what the possibilities are. 300 kW DC solar panel generation, ground mount insulation, went right in the back where that big blank field is, canvas I'll call it. 250 kW inverter, battery storage capacity of 200 kW with 568 kilowatt hours, pushes excess energy back to the building grid, grid forming capabilities in the event of a utility outage, and batteries charged on the excess solar. So just all the way around, when we thought of resiliency and at the end of the, our 3 microgrids installed, this one I think spells resiliency and really accomplished, I think, if we had the checklist, most of the items on that checklist. So next slide. Just some more pictures of showing the progress. Next slide. That's the battery pack, large solar array behind the clinic, so definitely needed a lot of space. This is just a battery picture, so what makes these systems unique is the batteries. Next slide. Planning and development, again, we use strategic planning done in 2012 and 2017, but also used an emergency preparedness plan. Again, this was definitely an extension from the 2016 flood. The tribe put a lot of emphasis into the strategic planning, both in renewable energy, but also into the emergency preparedness part of it. So several buildings and scenarios were identified for possible projects, not just with solar, but just in the emergency preparedness mitigation plan. Many other buildings were not in great condition, and looking at homes and buildings, you really had to target buildings that worked and make sense. Targeting buildings that are 50 to 60 years old may not be your best suited infrastructure. And again, these plans highlighted the infrastructure that we used. These were high priority health and wellness centers. Our clinic goes without saying why that would be a very important building in an emergency crisis. And then same with wastewater treatment plant. One of the biggest fails during the 2016 flood was the wastewater treatment plant and the backup of sewage almost in every single house that was attached to it. Keeping that building and keeping these buildings, powered during crisis is just one way to mitigate some of those specific crises that can happen. Next slide. The execution. So again, just highlighting some of the dates. Tribe does not own the infrastructure. So again, I think the other people who presented highlighted the PPAs and kind of the strategies that can go into not only just working with investors and stuff, but working with the utilities as well. So there's a lot of checks and balances on who you're checking with, making sure you can install these properly. Tribe's obviously the first one, but then obviously you got to work with the utilities and everyone else, the other stakeholders. Next slide. Through this, I mean, I have to highlight COVID. When we hired our contractors to install our systems, we basically issued our COVID pandemic things in March. So the big question was whether or not to go forth with the project. I think because this is a project based on resiliency, the working group within the tribe made it a really easy decision and said, let's push this forward. We don't know what the next days are going to look like. So made it really easy to make that decision. Made a lot of other stuff very difficult logistically. Virtual meetings actually ended up helping. So there's a lot of positives that came out of COVID, and I think just the ability to work through that was definitely a great positive of the project. Next slide. I think we can go into like COVID challenges for days. So, but this is one that I slide in there. Community acceptance. Renewable energy is great. I think if you got to get into it, you do it because it's the right thing to do, first of all. The second reasons why we did it is definitely for resiliency. And then I think the third and maybe follow-up reasons, there are some financial benefits. Community acceptance is not always going to be there. Replacing land with solar infrastructure. One elder specifically said, I don't know how to feel about these panels. The trees were nice. That's a simple statement, but it holds a lot of weight. So definitely make sure you do your community outreach, make sure you're having all of your stakeholders, which are those elders, which are those community members, and make sure you get their opinions and stuff about how they want to see these projects executed. Next slide. Again, you don't want to be in an incubator with these projects. These projects not only are, coming from strategic plannings, but once they're implemented, they do provide opportunities and open doors to other projects. So having a strategic plan for your specific projects will help. So this is a long-term plan that we specifically developed for the Ishkunagay Namadide Microgrid project. Goes through a phase and has a 7-phase approach with a tribal utility authority at the end. Won't get into that because that can mean many things for many tribes. Next slide. Next steps, executing the long-term phase energy plan. So we have completed and we did a virtual commission for our project. It just made sense after the COVID pandemic. Everything was kind of done virtually. Hey, let's have a virtual commissioning ceremony and ribbon cutting. So we did do that in May. We have completed the project. Kind of the next step is looking at phase 2 and how that directly ties in the new Head Start that was just built and the existing elderly building that's next to the Health and Wellness Center. So looking at that, tying that in, some of the other presenters mentioned it, policy can get in the way of some of these things. Tribal utility authority thoughts and that mindset can definitely get in the way of utilities accepting some of these things. So you have to work with the utilities, make them a part of the partners, make them a part of the process. So we're very excited. The utilities are definitely on board and we're excited to be working with them. So next slide. Training and workforce development. This is something that I think all tribes want to see within a lot of this infrastructure going up. So not just tribal members working and putting up solar panels, but these systems are highly technical. Someone mentioned what's going to happen once this is turned over to the tribe. That's probably one of the biggest questions for my team right now. The level of the extent of technology and just the level of expertise that is needed to operate and understand these systems goes without saying. And the tribes definitely need to make sure that they're addressing some of those issues in the beginning of the stages before the systems are even put in. So looking at that, that's something the tribe is definitely looking at all different levels. So just as facility managers, as operators, and so on, as that transfer does happen to the tribe. Next slide. Obviously wanted to give a shout out to the partners. So this does, these start with big working groups and, they continue to add partners. So Check Bay Renewables, Madison Solar, everyone on this list contributed to this project. And, without them, this project wasn't a possibility and wouldn't be executed properly. Next slide. Chi-Miigwech, big thank you. And look forward to the questions. Hopefully I left you guys enough time.
Thanks, Daniel. Excellent presentation and very impressive how you guys are able to get that project pushed through in the last year or so. It's impressive watching it from afar. And thanks for moving along on your presentation to give us time for these questions. I appreciate that. So let's move into the questions. Early on, we had a question on microgrids and are they moving away from diesel as a source of power. So I guess I open that question to the all our panelists, but also maybe you can elaborate on whether how important it is to even if you have diesel in your system, is it used a lot, or is it just a very occasional use in some microgrids and not a major source of carbon? Thanks.
James, I can probably start and comment on this. So I think if the diesel backup generator is already at the project site, it makes sense to integrate it as part of the microgrid architecture, right? So if the asset is already on site, there are ways to take that diesel backup generator as a backup to the microgrid, right? So that does require some level of design and engineering that needs to look at the different scenarios, right? In terms of what happens when there's a grid outage and how does the microgrid take over, but what happens if solar production is not sufficient and the loads are high or if the battery is being depleted, right? So I think that there are some technical considerations, but I would say that if the asset is already on site, then it makes sense to integrate it as part of the microgrid. There are some expenses, right, that have to be considered as well, because you do need probably additional set of components that will allow you to do that integration. And in some cases, it may not be trivial, right? So, but I think it does make sense to at least consider it. In the case of a site where there's no existing, backup diesel generator, you kind of have to look at some of the economic trade-offs, right? So if you have the ability to make some energy efficiency improvements, and you have the ability to manage your loads so that you can maintain critical loads during a disruption, and you can design the system to satisfy those needs, I think you may not need the diesel generator, but that's going to be a very expensive solution, right? So I think a lot of times, it's a matter of cost as you look into those decisions. Yeah, I don't know if anyone wants to comment, perhaps Stan.
I would say from Bad River's perspective, we have one diesel generator hooked up to our systems. It's kind of like what the last presenter said, where it's a part of the microgrid system. However, we do rely on kind of the solar and the batteries first, and then the generator is kind of the backup. So the initial goal is to kind of use clean energy first, with the generators being, kind of the backup to the backup. Just providing another layer of resiliency for our circumstance. We use 3 generators, only one generator is diesel, the other generators are natural gas.
Can I chime in? This is Stan.
Yes.
So in our analysis, what we do is our criteria is to minimize generator usage and maximize energy storage and renewables in our optimization scheme to get the maximum technical and economic benefit for a system. So that's the way you reduce the generator runtime, and then your rate of return out years, 15, 20 years of your system, and then you size the battery in such a way that you get the maximum return for the community. We've done a number of these analysis already, like for San Carlos Apache tribe, the Levelock village of Alaska, and working with the Piccaries tribe right now, asking those type of questions. And yeah, like the key thing is to reduce that runtime as much as you can, to reduce emissions and also to reduce maintenance, because the more you run that generator, the maintenance cost goes up, and all that comes into play technically and economically.
Thanks, all. A question here for you, Stan. You mentioned DC-based grids or power systems. Do you see that as a widely is that kind of an emerging area where in the future you see more microgrids being DC-based?
Yeah, there's still some hurdles though. For example, the good thing about the AC system, it has a natural zero crossing, which means that it's just oscillating and it goes to a natural crossover at zero current. But the DC is always there. So now you have to develop devices, especially for consumption by the user, to make sure that there's safety involved. So the safety is a thing, but at the same time, you gain some efficiencies by reducing the number of conversion you have to go through to interface these DC components. But lots of talks there, and lots of opportunities up on the horizon. In fact, there are a lot of, I saw a company that has a building side by side. One was an AC system and one was a DC system, and they're using the same AC line to implement the same system. I thought that was very interesting. So that way you don't have to rewire, but of course, you have to be you have to design the system properly. So the big thing is the safety of that. So the zero crossing is no longer there with a directed current DC system.
Great, thanks, Dan. A question for you, Daniel. Is there any plans to increase the battery storage on your system over time in the case of cost reductions or other reasons?
Absolutely. I specifically at the Health and Wellness Center, they're already looking at expansion. So phase 2 that we've already targeted, and we've already put out a proposal out there. Identified a proposal and strategy. Specifically looks at the addition of batteries and solar. So we're kind of going to apply that same strategy to the other buildings if they grow. Batteries also have other positives, so there's other benefits to add in, more batteries to just other systems in general as far as resiliency, but also increasing the financials. But yes, to be short, the Health and Wellness Center is definitely already planning for more batteries and more solar.
Thanks. Let's do one last question here. We're out of time, but let's squeeze this one in. As far as managing these grids, is it personnel intensive? Do you need to hire someone to do that as far as maintaining power quality and making the decisions, or is all that automated? And then if so, are these jobs desirable and competitive, high quality, so to speak, jobs?
Yeah, James, I think I can again start on this one. So I think in the ideal case, the microgrid is going to function in an autonomous and intelligent way, right? There will be always the need to do some maintenance and kind of monitor the system, but ideally, in terms of performing its functions, all of this will be done in a seamless manner, right? So the components communicate and coordinate with each other. There are algorithms that can use fairly advanced prediction models or algorithms to manage the resources and assets. But I think that since there is the need to maintain it and some components may fail over time, yeah, there is the high need for qualified personnel, right? And so I think in terms of the quality of jobs and how well they're compensated, I think there's a lot of opportunity. I mean, there is certainly in the future, we can see that in the foreseeable future, there will be more of these systems, not less, right? And being qualified, I think is important. I mean, some of these systems, they're fairly complex, right? So, for example, in the case of the SOCOMEC system that we're using at Chemehuevi, it is a fairly complicated system, and so there's only one electrical subcontractor in the California region that has the experience to work with this system. So they've been trained in Europe in order to look at all the components. So I would say that probably UCR is the second entity that has the ability to work on this particular type of battery solution, right? Yeah, I don't know if anyone else wants to comment.
Yeah, you did a great job. I think, there's a lot of opportunity for some really highly technical positions that, do very well for tribal people. And I think, again, that's one of the aspects of these systems that I think tribes and just whoever's installing microgrids needs to be in front of, because the operations and maintenance of these systems, there is a high level. There's programming that goes into probably every microgrid system. I can speak for mine, but there's definitely a lot of opportunity working with the technologies at hand.
Can I chime in real quick?
Daniel, sure.
Yeah. Do you have time real quick? Not sure how many more we can take.
Go for it.
The educational piece is huge for the tribes. In my mind, to get true sovereignty, energy sovereignty, you want the tribes to operate their systems on their own. To me, by definition, that is true sovereignty. So, we are thankful to the DOE Indian Energy Program to provide internship opportunities for Native American students, and to really teach them about these things, microgrids, the grid, energy storage, and all that stuff, and haven't really learned that. And then they go back to the tribes and be part of that. In fact, one of the students has gone through this Indian Energy summer internship programs, and she's actually now employed at the Navajo Tribal Utility Authority, being a renewable energy advisor on some of the energy the renewable energy deployment, along with, she understands the storage concept and all that. So it's getting there, but much needs to be done there to educate and to push that over, and ultimately to achieve true sovereignty. That's what I think in my mind.
Thanks, Dan. With that, we need to wrap up. We really appreciate all of our presenters today. Thanks so much for your time and efforts and high quality presentations. We really appreciate your contributions. On our final slide here, we just show the remaining webinars in our 2021 series. The next webinar is titled Electric Vehicle Opportunities and Challenges. It will be held on the 28th of July. All of our webinars are on the last Wednesday of every month. And with that, let's close, and we look forward to seeing you all again. Thanks for your interest and attendance, and this concludes the webinar for today. Good day.
Okay.
Thank you to all. Yeah.